Listen, there has been an incredible international response to coronavirus, with countries around the world putting their economies in lockdown. Why do you think that climate change doesn't generate the same sense of urgency?
Well, obviously because it's not being treated, it has never been treated as a crisis. It is still seen as this vague, distant topic. And then, of course, without perceiving it as a crisis, you won't be able to take measures that are necessary.
Why do you think climate change isn't regarded as a crisis in the same way as the coronavirus? Because arguably, it's much more of a systemic threat than coronavirus.
It's not like it's not affecting people already today. It's not like people are not already dying from it. But it's this kind of crisis that will sneak up on us later if we don't do anything.
But one thing that has come out of the coronavirus crisis has been that politicians had been saying, we have to listen to the scientists. Do you think politicians will now start to listen to scientists on climate change as well?
The main message that underlines everything that we do is listen to the science, listen to the scientists and the experts. And now all of a sudden you hear that everywhere, everyone is saying that, the people in power, the business leaders. It feels like the corona crisis has sort of changed the role of science in our societies, that we are suddenly starting to understand that, oh yeah, we actually have to listen to the experts. That's actually something that we depend on. But it just seems like we listen to the scientists that we can afford to listen to.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Norfolk Climate Change Conference. Climate change is arguably the most important challenge facing the human race today. It involves and threatens not just us, but future generations and all life on our planet. So we're here to ask 6 leading experts 6 very important questions, ranging from how people and governments are responding to what the scientists are telling us, to what each of us should be doing here in Norfolk about climate change. We also will also ask our panelists questions that members of our audience have sent in. Our leading experts are Dr. Hayley Pinto, a well-known psychiatrist and climate change activist, who is also a speaker on climate change for Greenpeace. A modern-day Emmeline Pankhurst, she follows a long line of brave, highly educated female political activists who have been arrested conducting protests outside the Houses of Parliament. Rupert Read, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia, Green Party campaigner and a fine orator, who was until recently a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Rupert's most recent book is Extinction Rebellion: Insights from the Inside. Sadly, Rupert is not very well just now. He has been pretty overwhelmed with stress and hard work, and he may not be able to stay with us for the whole of the conference. We're very grateful that he has turned up for us, though. We also have Jeff Price, Associate Professor of Climate Change and Biodiversity at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in Norwich. He shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also president of the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society. Also, Dr. Pablo Salas Bravo, Prince of Wales Global Sustainability Fellow in Radical Innovation and Disruption at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and Deputy Director of the Cambridge Centre for the Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance at the University of Cambridge. Jack Fiennes, Environmental Spokesperson for the NFU and Conservation Officer for the Holkham Estate, the largest estate in Norfolk. And last, but certainly not least, Philip Richardson, a former farmer and author of An Appetite for Change, a book which asks whether governments, society, and farmers are willing to make the changes necessary to ensure the well-being of future generations. That's a lot of collective expertise here this afternoon. Each panelist will be asked to give a maximum 5-minute monologue on one of the key questions we're posing this afternoon. After each monologue, I shall invite 2 or 3 other panel members to add any points they wish to make. We will then move on to the next question and do the same again. After 2 questions have been dealt with in this way, I shall put some questions to both speakers that have been sent in by you, the audience. We'll then move on to the next 2 key questions and repeat the whole process. I hope that's clear. If it isn't, I'm sure you'll get the idea very quickly. The main thing as far as you, our audience, is concerned is to stay with us and submit some questions. I can't promise we'll get through all of them, but we'll do our best. One final point, as in the last Donald Trump-Joe Biden debate, we do have a mute button. This certainly isn't because any of our panelists are likely to talk over one another. They're much too professional for that. It's simply because our schedule is very tight and we can't afford anyone to overrun their time slot by more than a few seconds. They have all been warned. So let me begin with the first of our key questions put to Dr. Hayley Pinto. Why have we been able to respond to the coronavirus crisis so dramatically and change our behavior when so far we haven't responded similarly to the climate change crisis?
Well, I'm not sure I've even nearly earned the right to be compared to Emmeline Pankhurst, but thank you for the compliment. And thank you to everyone who's made the time to attend today. It's a bit weird speaking alone to my computer, but I'm hoping that you're all out there listening. So why such a different response to coronavirus versus the climate crisis? Campaigns for action on the climate crisis have met with decades of dangerous inertia. Despite potentially catastrophic impacts, we've been told global change on the scale required is impossible and we're naive to think otherwise. And yet in the past year, we've seen the rule book on what's possible torn up and burnt. Is this because the pandemic is a bigger threat? Well, rationally, no. So far, the global death toll from COVID-19 is around 1.25 million. Now, every one of those deaths is a tragedy to a family somewhere, and I'm sure that all of our hearts go out to those who've lost a loved one. But air pollution alone kills over 7 million people worldwide every single year. Every one of those lives matters too. Climate change threatens the basic requirements of life. Air, water, food supplies, our homes. Over 20 million people have been driven from their homes by extreme weather fueled by climate change every year for the past decade. So if we were entirely rational, we would be acting on the climate and ecological emergencies with an equivalent or greater degree of urgency versus the pandemic. Clearly, we're not. Why? Well, our brains evolved when we lived as hunter-gatherers, so we're wired to respond to obvious, personal, immediate threats like predators. If we consider media reporting of the pandemic, it was perfectly attuned to trigger our instinctive fear response, framed as a health issue threatening us now. We were subject to rapid bombardment with headlines like killer virus, constant updates on death tolls, and heart-wrenching stories of people dying alone, arguably one of the worst aspects of this pandemic. These human stories activate the primitive part of the brain, the limbic system, which deals with basic emotions like fear. In contrast, media reporting of the climate emergency has been framed as a complex environmental and scientific issue, stats on the volume of ice lost, not as a risk to our health. Human victims to date have been predominantly in the global south, interpreted as somewhere else, not me, not here. And it's slower, so we've time to adapt to the new normal, and the threat is presented as being to future generations. But our brains tend to prioritize smaller immediate rewards, like keeping our SUVs, over larger later rewards, like keeping a habitable planet for our kids. This is a built-in cognitive bias called hyperbolic discounting. The slower pace has also given vested interests time to engage in campaigns to sow doubt about the evidence, undermining any sense of urgency. And this was easy to do because we want to doubt. Confirmation bias, a tendency to pay attention to information which fits our beliefs, means we choose to hear what we want to hear and ignore uncomfortable truths. Also, we prefer simple, linear solutions intuitively linked to the issue. This works for COVID. Wash hands, stay away from people. The solutions to climate change require complex systems thinking and not always intuitive. For example, driving a car doesn't feel bad, unlike coughing on someone during a pandemic. And unlike lockdown, sustainability is forever. As we all know, it's easier to stick to a brief crash diet than change our eating habits long term. Also, we prefer to attend to problems with solutions we like, but many climate solutions are in conflict with the prevailing political ideology of free trade. So those who currently hold power, and hence are perceived as aspirational role models, have preferred to ignore it. Silence from our leaders reinforces a tendency to dismiss its importance, and politicisation of the issue has hamstrung constructive debate. There was no time to politicise COVID. Governments focused on this crisis because it was apparent they would be judged on their response within the current electoral cycle, immediate reward. Not so for climate change, where the changes are now, but the benefits are years in the future, back to hyperbolic discounting. Also, they can protect their population from COVID with unilateral action, but for climate change, a coordinated international response is needed, activating the bystander effect. The more diffuse the responsibility, the less likely any one individual will act. So there are numerous psychological barriers to governments and individuals speaking up or taking action on climate change. So where can we find hope? Well, COVID has challenged our assumption of dominance over the natural world. In fact, it's highlighted our inextricable relationship with, our vulnerability to, and our reliance on it. But perhaps most importantly, the global response to COVID has demonstrated the truth, in the words of Christiana Figueres, who negotiated the Paris Agreement. Impossible is not a fact, it's an attitude. Thank you.
Dr. Pinto, thank you very much. Rupert Reed, do you have any points to add to what Dr. Pinto has just said?
Yeah, look, I think what Hayley just said is basically absolutely right, and it's very well taken. But I want to add, I'm afraid, a somewhat more pessimistic or, if you will, realistic coda to it, which is here in the UK today, we are on the verge of a second lockdown. How in hell's name did it come to this? It came to this because actually our government's response to the coronavirus pandemic, while it's been far better than its response to the climate crisis, has been in the round pathetic. It's been completely unprecautious. It's been completely incompetent. It's been deeply unserious. And this is an extremely depressing fact. If, as Hayley says, the coronavirus is actually a lot easier to deal with than climate, and it is, and if our response to it across most of the world, not all, look at countries like New Zealand or Taiwan, and to some extent China for a more effective response, then I'm afraid we have to conclude that that puts us in a very poor prognosis vis-a-vis climate. And that is what I'm going to be elaborating on in my remarks.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Jeff Price, any additional points you would like to add?
So many years ago, I was at a meeting in the London School of Economics, and we discussed just this issue of why don't you take climate change seriously? Why can't we be on a war footing to come against climate change? How does climate change differ from COVID? It's the same thing. And the response basically was, well, in World War II, the bombs were falling on you. You saw the damage, people died. You knew something was happening, you took action. With COVID, you at least see the news. You may very well have known people who had it. You may have known people who died. And so you take action. And yet even now, it's gone on long enough that you're seeing uncertainty, skepticism, denialism, even creeping into this debate. And you're seeing it creeping into this debate much faster because of social media. You're seeing the protests saying we don't wear masks. So the same distrust of science and distrust of scientists that impact climate change is now appearing for COVID as well.
Jeff, thank you very much for your comments. Now, Philip, can you add anything to what's been said?
A couple of comments, if I may, Chairman. The first is that climate change needs international cooperation more than anything else. And the response to the pandemic so far has been somewhat notable in its lack of international cooperation, which is a worry. Secondly, up till perhaps a few months ago, most governments would have said that they couldn't find sufficient cash to deal with a crisis of this nature. Funnily enough, most of them have. The danger then is they will say, well, we've spent it all, we haven't got any left for climate change.
Thank you very much, Philip. Pablo, can you add anything to what's been said? Hello? Oh, we'll move on then. Rupert, I'd like now to move on to the second of our key questions and invite Rupert Reed to give us his thoughts on whether he believes there are any lessons to be learned from our response to coronavirus for the climate change challenge.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Pleasure to be here. And it's an amazing day to be having this conversation on the day when England is contemplating a second lockdown. We've come to this point in this country because of a desperate failure to follow the science and to follow the precautionary principle. And that in relation to a crisis that is a lot more tractable than the climate crisis. What are the implications of this? So I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to cut straight to the chase. The brutal reality that hardly anyone is yet prepared to admit is that we are not going to deal adequately with the climate crisis. That is the tragic, horrific fact of the situation. Our climate is going to deteriorate. It is very likely going, in important respects, to break down. The only question is how rapid that process is and how terminal it is or isn't, and what happens in our societies in response. In other words, the live question is, do our societies break down or not in response to this mother of all challenges? So what I want to say to you this afternoon is, please stop thinking that we are in a position to apply the precautionary principle adequately to this crisis, to prevent it, even to mitigate it in the kind of way that people have been talking about for recent years. We are not. We should try to do all those things. I've been doing all those things for years and will continue to do so. But it is time to admit that we are going to some considerable extent, fail to adequately address this crisis. If we can't adequately address COVID, there is no possibility that we're going to adequately address climate. What does this mean? It means that we have to adapt. It means that we have to get serious about adaptation, because climate decline is coming. It is going to get worse in the lifetimes of virtually all of us. It is conceivable it could be turned around within the lifetimes of our children, but very unlikely. What kind of adaptation do we undertake? That is really the critical question. Do we undertake incremental adaptation? Do we try basically to keep our system going as it is? Do we do things like build higher levees and higher seawalls and hope that that will keep out the tides that are coming? Well, if we do that, then we are simply pushing ourselves further off the cliff. We are prolonging a system which is bound to fall apart and collapse even further beyond its natural life. What we need to do is to pursue what in my think tank Greenhouse we call transformative adaptation. We need to seek to transform the system, to mitigate, to work with nature rather than against nature, and to create the better society that is still possible, while recognizing that climate decline and ecosystem decline are to some considerable extent now baked in. So transformative adaptation is an extremely bold agenda, which has barely begun to be considered. It will be considered more and more during the 2020s. If it is considered adequately, there is some hope for the human race, and there is some hope of avoiding civilizational collapse. If it is not considered inadequately, then there is not. What do I reckon are the chances? I think they're pretty slim, but I still think we should go for it and give it our best shot. And to the extent that we engage in transformative adaptation and get serious about recognizing that it is no longer credible to talk about ending or solving or reversing the climate emergency, then we will make our lives and the lives of our children better. What kind of things does this mean in concrete terms? Let me end by saying something about that. So in terms of my example of floods, sea level rise, etc., it means things like restoring wetlands, restoring in other parts of the world mangrove swamps. It might mean things like building floating islands where people can grow food or even live. In terms of growing food, which is absolutely critical, it means that we need to take seriously action on the international level and the national level, and because those levels are almost certainly going to act inadequately, most crucially on the local level, to create community resilience. So my message to you this afternoon is please do not remain within the silo of thinking, what should the government do? What should policymakers do? What new technologies are possible, etc. Those questions are not going to be adequate to address our future. please start also to consider questions like, what are we going to do in my community? What am I going to do to ensure that there is some kind of solid food supply going into the future? How are we going to create a future where the wake-up call that coronavirus has been giving us will come through to create a transformatively adapted society in the face of the dire threat that we are now facing? That is the real question before us.
Rupert, thank you very much indeed. That's a very powerful statement. Dr. Pablo Salas, I'll come to you at the right time this time. Any thoughts on what Rupert has just said?
Yes, I do apologize because my internet connection is breaking down, so that's why I couldn't hear you before. Well, I do agree with Rupert regarding the necessity on adapting. We cannot just trust that things are going to get better. We definitely need to adapt at all levels. However, I do a more optimistic view in things that are some transformations are happening, and some things can go positively. And I'm going to talk a bit more about in my own segment, but definitely agree with the importance of adapting.
Pablo, thank you very much. Jake Fines for the first time. Any additional points you would like to make?
All horribly pessimistic, but I think we have to be as optimistic as possible. The climate change has started. Climate change, and this year is the wonderful example that we've seen extremes in weather conditions in the UK. We've had probably one of the most disastrous harvests for a generation. And those are the examples, but we also have some wonderful examples where we can make changes. And I think we must not give up hope for the next generation, because they are the ones, the Greta Thunbergs of this world, they are the ones that are pushing the current generation that are in control to make changes. And what have we learned from coronavirus? We have learned that we're wonderfully unable to work with one another to seek out solutions for our global problems. So hopefully coronavirus gives us an example that actually we need to work collectively and globally for to reduce the impact that is going to happen, but to reduce the impact of climate change.
Jake, may I just say that I agree with what you've just said.
Sorry, Rupert, could I just, I'm afraid we're going to try and make that point when you have a chance to later on. If I could just go now to Dr. Hayley Pinto and ask Hayley to add anything that she needs to say.
Thank you, Rupert. I would agree that the current data coming out all over the world looks pretty bleak. But we are an innovative species, and we have dug ourselves out of holes in the past. I was talking to my kids earlier about the fact that when I was a kid, I couldn't imagine carrying something that was the size of an envelope around in my pocket that could do all the things that our smartphones can do. So we have to have hope, and the reason that we have to have hope is, as an addiction psychiatrist, I work with motivation. What motivates behavior change, and it's not just identifying that something is important. We have to also believe that it's achievable. So if we give up hope, then it's much more difficult to motivate people. And to motivate people, I think one of the things that the climate change movement has missed out is really articulating a clear, positive vision of what a sustainable society looks like. And I think we need to get better at painting that picture for people. And when we draw too many parallels with what's happened during lockdown, that's quite negative, because actually what's happened is that people have been cut off from their friends and family, unable to kind of give and receive a hug. And we need to be, focusing on the fact that a sustainable society is actually about refocusing away from consumerism, away from the things that don't matter, onto what really matters: our health, our time with family and friends, our food supply. So yes, whilst on the one hand I would say absolutely it does look pretty bleak, we can't give up hope. We have to maintain that.
Hayley, thank you very much. Sorry, Rupert, but you will have a chance to come back on what you wanted to say in a few moments. We're now going to move to our first Q&A session, where I put some supplementary questions to our first few speakers that have come in from you, our audience. So please do keep the questions coming in by Zoom chat. You don't have to give your name. In fact, most of the people submitting questions so far have asked for their names to be withheld. The first question we have is for Hayley. Some people take the view that there's no point Britain taking a lead on climate change because other far larger countries are producing far more greenhouse gases. What would you say to them?
I would say that it's never been more important for the UK to take action, because next year we're hosting COP26, and as hosts, if we can't lead by example, what hope have we got of persuading others to make the necessary commitments? And let's face it, countries like China, yes, have higher emissions, but also have bigger populations. And to assess this honestly, we need to look at per person emissions. And we need to include historical emissions, which are still in the atmosphere, which are high for the UK because we started the Industrial Revolution, and embedded emissions, those in products we consume that are made elsewhere, like in China. You know, this is like cooking on your neighbour's barbecue and then complaining about the smoke. If we do all that, then UK residents remain in the higher emission brackets. Also, we're the 6th largest GDP. If we can't do this, then who can? And we achieved this position of affluence through our empire. Now, many of the world's poorest countries already on the front line of climate change were subject to colonial activity, which was effectively resource theft. And it's continued to this day by large international corporations. Just look at the Niger Delta. So we should be helping lift them out of poverty by leapfrogging fossil fuel technology and moving straight to renewables. And if we can't see that as a moral duty, we should consider it an act of self-preservation, because if those countries develop using fossil fuel technology, then we're all fried.
Hayley, thank you indeed. Now a question for Rupert. Rupert, not today, but you are on record as saying in the past that renewables are not the answer. Why did you say that? The modern world surely needs huge quantities of energy, and if it's not going to come from fossil fuels, surely it must come from renewables.
That is another misrepresentation, I'm afraid. What I said in the article in question is that renewables are not the answer if they are considered as a like-for-like substitute for fossil fuels. The future is going to run on less energy. The only question is whether that less energy that it runs on is a small amount of fossil fuels, in which case we carry on making the situation worse, or a small amount of renewables, which is all that there realistically is. We do not have enough renewables to replace like for like the fossil energy that there is. Or if it may run on hardly any energy. That will be the case if it collapses. And that is where we are, exactly where we are heading at the moment. And if I may add to that, in response to the criticisms that Hayley and Jake just made of me, they talk about the need for hope. And my response is, hope for what? If you ask people to hope for things that are not going to happen, all you're doing is fooling people. What I'm saying is, let's hope for things that can actually happen. Let's hope for a world that is run on a small amount of renewable energy. Let's hope for a world that transformatively adapts. Let's hope for a world that we can actually attain. The longer we carry on pretending that we're going to have a world in which we sort of more or less continue living the way that we are, the more certain we make it that we will collapse.
Rupert, again, make very powerful points. Thank you. I've now got an interesting question from Hayley Pinto, from a retired teacher. To what extent do you think the refusal by some to accept the consensus scientific view on climate change is just a smokescreen to conceal their disregard for the welfare of future generations?
Okay, so there is evidence that antisocial and narcissistic personality traits, which reduce the capacity to care for others, are overrepresented in individuals who achieve powerful positions. And I think we can all agree that there are some good examples of this amongst our world leaders today. But it's not fair to say that everyone who fails to accept the scale of the problem just doesn't care about their children. Many people are struggling to keep their children fed and roofs over their heads. They simply don't have the mental space left to worry what will happen to them in 30 years' time. And for others, as I've just outlined, there are many ways that our brains are wired to help us avoid this truth. Really facing it is emotionally overwhelming. As parents, if we take on board that the normal things we would do to protect our children, caring for their health, a loving home, education, financial support, are negated by this threat, that leaves us not knowing how to act, and feeling powerless is awful, so we find ways to deny it. And that's easier when others around us are not acting. We tell ourselves that it can't be that bad. The truth looks like a script for a Hollywood disaster movie, so we let ourselves believe that just like in the movies, some magical technical solution or hero will come along at the last minute and fix it.
Hayley, thank you, and thank you everybody for being so brief and keeping to time. We have another question for Rupert Reed from a retired publisher. What actions do you believe everyone should be taking to help solve the climate crisis on an individual basis?
Yeah, okay, great question. First point, as I sought to explain in my remarks, we're not going to solve this crisis. That's the wrong question. The question is, what can we do to mitigate it and what can we do to adapt to it? And the answers are many, but chief among them are, I would say, the following two. Firstly, we need mass nonviolent direct action. And I mean mass. What we've seen from Extinction Rebellion should be nothing compared to what's coming. And I believe it is possible that we will see far, far huger nonviolent direct action, especially when parents start to step into their power. Because when parents realize that they cannot outsource this any longer, that governments and corporations are not going to fix it, that no one is going to fix it, and it's a question of mitigation and adaptation, they are going to be so enraged and so passionate that I believe they will rise up in huge numbers. And that's why my next book is called Parents for a Future. I believe we need a worldwide movement of parents outraged and absolutely determined to protect their children, which they can no longer do on an individual basis. And the second thing that we need, which goes along with that, as I've said, is transformative adaptation. And that starts in your community. So think about questions like, how am I going to get food in the future? How am I going to get water in the future? Because you cannot guarantee, even in this country, a rich developed country, you cannot guarantee that for the next 10 or 20 years, the government and local authorities and so on are going to be able to continue to provide those things. You cannot guarantee that the normal that we are used to is going to continue.
Thank you, Rupert. Haley, do you agree with that? Given where we are now, where do you think we're most likely to be in climate change in 20 years' time?
I'm looking at the data at the moment. I would have to say that I to a large extent, I agree with Rupert. The chances of a sort of global crop failure over the next couple of decades is huge. We're already seeing massive impacts on agriculture. And of all the health risks that I talk about in other lectures, I would say that food security and water security are the biggest risk. And I think we all need to be thinking about how we can improve our local food security, how we can be managing our water better. And yeah, you know, really thinking about how we can build communities that are more resilient, that are looking out for each other. In terms of how we change the government, I absolutely agree. The only way forward that I can see is mass non-violent direct action, because lobbying, talking to your MP, sending letters, signing petitions, it's all been done for decades. And what I loved was the words of the editor-in-chief of the Lancet. It's probably the most prestigious medical journal in the world, who said basically, because doctors have a duty of care around public health, all health professionals, you know, 1.5 million NHS employees across the country, if we all took action, that's now our duty of care. And that would be the best way to start pushing for real change.
Haley, thank you very much. That paints, between Haley and Rupert, they have very eloquently painted, I would say, a somber picture of the future, and certainly a feeling of how large and how huge a task we are facing. That brings us to the end of session 1 and our first pair of key questions. We now move on to session 2 to tackle the second pair. The first of these will be addressed by Dr. Pablo Salas to see if there isn't a more optimistic future. Dr. Salas, will the rapid growth of renewables deal with the problem, or must far more be done?
Okay, let me share my screen because I want to use some figures that will help us in the discussion. So many thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to engage in this conversation. I have been asked to answer the question, will the rapid growth of renewables deal with the problem, or must far more be done? And here, let me show you the first picture, in which we can see a summary of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions globally today. As you can see in red, most of the emissions come from the use of energy, mainly fossil fuels in industry, in buildings, and also in transport. This represents, for instance, using coal and gas for producing electricity, using petrol or diesel in our cars, and so on. So here is our first hint to the question. renewables can help us to replace fossil fuels and reduce emissions in many processes associated with energy use, particularly processes that are or can be electrified. However, there is still a significant proportion of emissions that cannot be addressed by renewable energies. For instance, as you can see in the green part of the chart, there is a significant contribution coming from agriculture, forestry, and land use. There are also emissions associated to the use of fossil fuels in industries such as cement, where the chemical properties of the fuel are important. Therefore, in most processes, the replacement of fossil fuels is not as straightforward, and we may need more time to find a way to replace them. So the immediate answer is clear. We cannot only rely on renewables, we need to do far more. But what about the energy sector, particularly the electricity sector, where renewables are a key player? Will the rapid growth of renewables deal with the problem there? Here's in the second picture, we can see the total installed capacity of the global power sector between the years 2008 and 2018. In yellow, in the bottom, we have modern renewables, which are mostly solar and wind, plus a tiny bit of the rest. In green, we have hydropower, and in gray, we have non-renewables, which are mostly coal, followed by gas and a bit of nuclear. On the one side, the yellow area is growing fast, which is very good news. The adoption of solar and wind energy is being fueled by a sharp decrease in cost, which is accelerating the entire process over time. On the other hand, the demand for electricity, the total area of the chart, is also growing fast, driving the gray area to grow as well. So renewable electricity is growing very fast, but fossil fuel electricity is still growing. So the question is, can renewables grow fast enough to provide the energy necessary to reach the net zero target in 2050, even taking into account the growth in energy demand from developing countries? Modeling groups from scientists working on low carbon transition scenarios in several groups indicate it may be possible. There are, of course, some serious socioeconomic and technological challenges, such as the destruction of raw materials, grid intermittency, or reliance on carbon capture and storage. But everything indicates that the global power sector may become carbon neutral by mid-century, and low carbon electricity will be the key to decarbonize the rest of the economy. But going beyond the technical challenge, it is important to understand the large level of uncertainty surrounding the entire process. There are many things we don't know and we cannot control, such as the amount of people living in our planet, their future diets. Are they going to be vegetarians? Are they going to eat a lot of meat? What is going to be their income, and many other variables. All of these are and more will influence the amount of greenhouse gases the global economy will produce. Therefore, the relevant question is, shall we just hope for renewables to be enough, or shall we do more? And the resounding answer is we need to do a lot more. In very simple words, we need to make this circle disappear by mid-century. And that cannot be done purely by adopting renewable energies. Thank you.
Dr. Salas, thank you very much for, again, keeping to time so well and for making some very powerful points. Jake, any points to add to what Pablo has just said?
The only point is sometimes that we look at renewables as a green ray of light for solving our fossil fuel addiction. But I have concern that all of the solar panels that are going up, all of the digesting plants and all of the producing electricity and gas through renewable energies potentially are flawed in some respects. And then what do we do with these vast amounts of panels once they've come to the end of their life? Something to bear in mind for the future generations.
Jake, thank you. Philip, any other perspectives on what's been said?
Yes, as you've heard, my specialty is agriculture and food. And as Pablo said, 20% of the total emissions come from that area, if we include forest destruction and so on. And with a growing world population and increasing affluence and the need for different types of food, which are more intensive in terms of energy use and land use, we do need to do something very considerably in global agriculture to affect this problem. So it isn't, I agree with Pablo, it certainly is a renewable only solution. We clearly have a great deal to do in agriculture and food too.
Jeff Price, any additional perspectives on whether renewables will solve the problem for us?
Well, we need to think about the fact that renewables have their own greenhouse gas emissions. People often look at renewables and say, oh, well, this is fine, we don't need to worry about it. But hydropower in the tropics, particularly in the first decade after a dam is built, can actually release more methane than and actually be, again, a significant contributor to fossil fuel emissions and green and warming. So it's not fossil fuels, but emissions and warming than if you had simply used fossil fuels. So, you know, while what we need to do is be as close to sunlight as possible.
Jeff, thank you. And finally, Hayley, any points to add to on the renewables?
Yeah, I would say definitely more needs to be done. Evidence from the Arctic tells us the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is already too high. So to restabilise the climate, we're going to need to be moving to a point where we're carbon negative, not just neutral. And that means we need to take into account the potential for carbon drawdown. And the most efficient system that we have available to us for that is photosynthesis. And that means we need to restore nature. We need to stop deforestation. We need to start a programme of global reforestation. And we need to protect our oceans. These get forgotten, and they provide more than half the photosynthetic activity on the planet. We should expand and properly protect marine protected areas, which currently cover only 7% of the world oceans. Many are barely protected. Over 90% of the UK's so-called marine protected areas in the last year were subject to bottom trawling. Greenpeace are pushing for 30% of the high seas to be protected. Governments are meeting for the final time to discuss a potential ocean treaty next year. And if you want to support this, there's an active petition on the Greenpeace website. Write to your MP, write to Boris Johnson, get that done.
Hayley, thank you indeed for finishing on such a strong note. Now that's the end of question 3. We now move on to the 4th of our key questions and invite Dr. Jeff Price to address the question, why would it be foolish to think scientists may be wrong and therefore we don't need to do anything to fight climate change?
So we often talk about whether we should believe scientists or not, and this isn't a case of belief. Belief is Santa Claus, it's the tooth fairy. It's a question of should we trust climate scientists? And often this goes back to should we trust scientists at all? The science behind climate change is sound, and it's not new. We've known about the impacts of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere since at least the 1800s, and we've known about it very strongly since the mid-1900s. So the relationship of infrared as trapping and warm greenhouse gases is highly significant. And in fact, if we didn't have a greenhouse effect, a natural greenhouse effect, there would be no life on Earth. Earth would actually be a giant snowball. It would be an icy planet. The distance from the sun is simply not close enough to trap enough heat in the absence of a certain amount of greenhouse gases. But you can always have too much of something. And you can make the greenhouse so it stores too much heat. Now, anybody who really thinks about climate change and thinks about greenhouse gases or thinks about the greenhouse effect probably has experienced this. On a hot summer's day, your car has the windows rolled up. You go and get inside your car. Your car is hotter inside than it is outside. Well, how is that possible? If it's been sitting there all day, the only place it can get heat would have been from the engine. So it's gotten hot because of infrared radiation coming in, being trapped inside the glasses and heating up the surface. And that's exactly what happens on Earth. So it's not a question of belief, it's a question of trust. And there's been a lot of research that actually shows, well, then who should we trust? Why should we trust? And in terms of science, it's found that the earlier we teach children about science, the more science they actually learn, the more they trust scientists. And the less science they know, the less they trust scientists. So that's one end. Then you have journalists using proportional representation or trying to give equal sides to both the deniers and the scientists. So the people are then confused thinking, well, there are as many people who say there is no climate change as says there is climate change, when in fact it's about 98-2. And in one paper that actually looked at, well, what is that 2%? They actually tend to be some of the oldest scientists who should have published most in the field of why they're right, why there is no climate change. And in fact, they've published the least. So people don't want to change their way of thinking overall. And then you have an entire body, an industry designed to make you not believe in climate change. So climate change denial isn't a lot of individuals. It's driven by a very strong lobby, much of it out of the United States, many of it the exact same people who tried to convince you years ago that smoking was good for you. Smoking did not cause cancer. Fire retardant chemicals did not cause cancer. That's their business. It's their business to sow doubt. And Naomi Oreskes covered this very well in her book, Merchants of Doubt. And I would strongly recommend, you can find this online, that you watch the documentary, Merchants of Doubt, so you can see how you're being manipulated. And then social media makes it much, much worse, because you tend to talk to your own friends and you get their doubt, and it helps build upon your own doubt so that you don't actually trust climate scientists. Communicators of climate science and climate impacts tell scientists we shouldn't talk about how bad it's going to be. And yet that's precisely what we get with COVID. We hear about the deaths, we hear about the death projections, and yet you'll have people saying we shouldn't talk about how bad it is. I disagree with this point of view. We have to be realistic. We have to let people know what the problems are. We have to know what the subtleties are. When we talk about health impacts, when we talk about changing our diet and changing our food supply, we tend not to talk about the fact that as you enhance carbon dioxide, you reduce the amount of protein and micronutrients in plants. This is going to affect both cows and the amount of land they need to graze, but also the amount of nutrition we get from the same amount of plants. We're going to all have to eat more to get the same nutrition or modify our crops. So we need to stop thinking about it as, should we trust this or not? Listen to the science, listen to the scientists. There are uncertainties. Yes, we can tell you what they are, but the science around is there climate change is sound.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed. That is a wonderful exposition of the position of the scientists. I've never heard better than that. Thank you. Hayley, would you like to add any points to what Jeff has just said?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The primary point is it worth the risk of saying, oh no, we don't trust them, because we've only got one planet. You know, that there isn't anywhere else to move to if we mess this up, then you know, that's it. I liked what Jeff said about the advice not to be too scary. When I first started talking about this stuff, you know, that was very much the advice we give. Oh, don't be too scary, it'll put people off, they just stick their heads back in the sand. And actually, you know, I think the opposite is true. I think you've got to be honest with people. I take it from the point of view of, you know, as a doctor, we operate within the framework of informed consent. You know, years ago, you might not have told somebody that they had cancer because you didn't want to upset them. You know, people have a right to know. People, you know, that's a matter of dignity and choice. So I think it's really important that we're honest, that we you know, that we let people know really what we're facing, and to a degree, you know, I agree a little bit with Rupert about that. You know, we've got to be realistic about the fact that we have, you know, we're past the point where we can just fix this now. But there's a lot that we can do, and you know, frankly, I've got 3 children. While there's still any chance, why wouldn't you try? Why wouldn't you throw everything at it? And I think, you know, that's a really important point as well about, you know, actually activating parents, bringing out the mother tiger in people, and saying, actually, you know, look at what is happening here. Look realistically at what the future for your children looks like. and then get out and do something about it.
Haley, thank you again. Now another scientist again, Pablo. Anything else you'd like to add to what Jeff and Haley have said?
Well, I completely agree with what they say. Science is not about beliefs, it's about fact. So if you don't trust the theory of gravity, you die. And the same should happen if you don't trust climate scientists, because a lot of people will die if we don't do it. But I want to address maybe and extend a bit the point, which is that climate change is just one of several challenges we're facing today. Indeed, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, climate action is the number 13 of a total of 17 challenges. So even if we don't trust climate scientists, replacing fossil fuels will have a lot of benefits for our societies in terms of health, in terms of losing dependence of specific resources, geopolitics, and so on. Therefore, climate actions make a lot of sense, even if we don't trust climate scientists. That's something that we should totally do, by the way.
Pablo, thank you. Jake, do you have anything to add on what's been said so far?
Just Jeff is absolutely right. We must be led by the science. It is crucial, you know, something that our government has failed to recognise as being led by the science. But also, it's very key on how the science is presented, because the presentations of the facts has the opportunity by others who are skeptics to challenge the science. But also, it is fundamentally key that science also gives us the solutions. Because yes, we know we need to move around the world less, we need to use less fossil fuels, we need to change our diets, we need to change our land use, we need to look at natural solutions. But it's the science needs to give us those keys to enable us to open the doors to give us some hope, Rupert.
And thank you, Jake. And Philip, finally, Philip. Not always finally, Philip, but this time, finally, Philip.
I've farmed for 50 years in Norfolk, and it's very noticeable that weather patterns have changed in that time. And anyone watching TV will see how the weather has changed much more than that in many other parts of the world. Of course, that doesn't tell us the reasons why, but even those with a small basis in science can see that the evidence is stacking up, that human activity has got something to do with it. And conspiracy theories continue to do the rounds a little bit, but even the early deniers, many of them, such as Lord Lawson, now admit the reality of climate science, even though they still advise slow adaptation to it, rather than preemptive action. But I think denial probably stems from two sources: the fear of big government, possibly, but also, as Jeff has referred to, the self-interest of companies which do their business using energy. But it's interesting that the oil companies, both BP and Shell, in the last couple of weeks have both come forward with plans to divest themselves of their fossil fuel interests, maybe over too long a period, but they have come forward. So to me, I have to say, to quote Donald Trump, climate denial is now fake news.
That's a very good position to finish on there. Right, we are now at the end of question 4. Philip, thank you very much. It's now time for our second 2 speakers to address some questions on their topics from the audience. So please do keep the questions coming in by Zoom chat. As I said earlier, you can submit them anonymously, but it's nice if you can give your name. However, we've got some questions already. The first is again anonymous. It's for Dr. Pablo Salas. Are we facing a need for, say, 10 years of drastic cutbacks in energy consumption in your view, or is it more like 50? What do you think is economically and politically achievable with the right attitudes from politicians across the world?
Well, I believe that instead of framing it as cutbacks in energy consumption, what we should talk about is about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is indeed one of the pillars of the low carbon transition, and it is expected to play a significant role in decreasing emissions. And this will require changes on both sides, on the supply, technologies, and also on the demand side through consuming behavior. Now, the evidence shows that both sides can work together to create rapid transformations if they have the right incentives, and that's where policy plays a key role. For those interested in successful cases in the past, they can read, for instance, what happened in the UK transition to natural gas on the 60s and 70s, when the appliances of 14 million consumers were changed in a decade. So very strong transformation can happen if we have very good coordination.
Thank you. Jeff, another anonymous question has come in. Doesn't trying to abandon fossil fuel technologies too quickly risk causing more deaths than climate change because it will cause so many economies to fail?
But what's the proof it's going to cause the economies to fail? In many of the areas, in many of the developing parts of the world where climate change impacts are going to be the greatest, they often have the least amount of fuel and the least amount of fossil fuels to begin with. And we've already seen a fairly rapid transition in many parts of the developed world where this might be a more applicable question, that you're not seeing the economies failing. You're actually seeing the uptake of renewables and then new industries around renewable energy improve economies overall. And my last point would be, I haven't seen how big the last figure is for COVID, but it's in the trillions of dollars on impacts on the economy. This is one pandemic caused by one virus, which jumped from animals to humans. And while that has nothing to do with climate change, most scientists will tell you that as climate change gets worse, as people move, as crops fail, as they rely more on animals for food, as animals tend to move, then the interaction between humans and species that carry particularly coronaviruses is going to increase, and the likelihood of pandemics goes up. And so now you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars in losses and deaths, far exceeding anything you might imagine with abandoning fossil fuels.
Thank you, Jeff. I've got a related question here for Pablo Salas from a retired CEO. Is there a danger of destabilizing the world politically if oil and gas exports from Russia and Saudi Arabia drop drastically and quickly? How do you think these risks can best be ameliorated?
Well, I am not a political scientist, so I will address from the area that I work in, which is energy markets. So from an energy markets perspective, there is mounting evidence that fossil fuel companies may suffer a large financial shock due to the low carbon transition. This is known as the carbon bubble. The data show that we are decarbonizing faster than what fossil fuel companies expected. So they may end up with loss of unsellable resources that would lead to stranded assets. In the case of countries such as Russia and Saudi Arabia, where government budgets are strongly dependent on the performance of state-owned fossil fuel companies, this may create a large economic shock that may lead to political instability. Now, how can these countries ameliorate these risks? Well, they must decrease their dependence on fossil fuels by diversifying their economy.
Pablo, thank you. Another question for Jeff Price. This is a question from Scott Wesley. So I've had a name given to us, a climate scientist. How can we incite real change in government policy and in society? What can talking about the COVID crisis actually achieve? Well, of course, we've had suggestions that we shouldn't just be talking, but I'll leave you to answer that question, Jeff.
Well, unfortunately, for most governments, it's money talks. It all boils down to the economy, the economics. And even when you look at the arguments, this is mostly from Working Group 3 of IPCC, around how much should we mitigate, how much should we adapt, what's the cost of adaptation, what's the cost of mitigation. It all boils down to what's the cheapest way of doing something. And so you'll have governments say, well, then we should adapt because adaptation seems to be cheaper. But adaptation can't possibly cover all of the costs that are out there because there are so many factors that will be impacted, especially biodiversity, that we can't put a value on. Now we have cost for a singular event. You could call it a low probability, high impact event. It's probably not a low probability event given how prevalent coronaviruses are. One pandemic, multiple trillions of dollars. We know how much now. We know roughly how much natural capital there is. How much is in pollination? These are actually monetary amounts. The problem is how much can we convince politicians to quit discounting the future and realize that the children are just as important as the now, and therefore we should be being honest with our economics and how much it's going to cost throughout time without a discount rate.
Jeff, thank you. Now, I was going to draw a close to this session now, but I've had a very good question in, funnily enough, from a retired management consultant. It's for Pablo. Clearly, the question is as follows. Clearly, we won't succeed in achieving zero carbon emissions until all fossil fueled power stations on the planet have been decommissioned. The cost of doing this has been estimated at over $100 trillion, or 4% of global GDP annually for the next 30 years. Is there any sign that governments around the world understand the size of the challenge and are prepared to address it seriously? And if not, isn't a radical change of lifestyle for us all and a huge reduction in personal energy consumption the only alternative?
Well, funnily enough, part of my PhD was about modeling the process of replacing power stations based on their life cycles. And one of the main conclusions from that research was that you can get strong decarbonization trajectories with a minimum risk of early scrapping or early decommissioning, but you need regulation that stops the creation of new fossil fuel power plants. That's the key. Now, that sounds very obvious, but there are still plenty of coal power stations being planned, let alone built, around the planet today. Are governments taking this matter seriously? Well, some of them are. For instance, the UK government confirmed in 2018 their intention to phase out coal in 2025 and restrict their use in 2023. They gave enough time for the energy sector to prepare, and the policy has been such a success that the government is planning to bring forward the phase out of coal by 1 year to 2024.
Thank you, Pablo. I've had a message, Jeff, that you would like to, I'm so sorry, Rupert Reed would like to ask a question of one of our panelists or all of them, I'm not sure which.
Yes, I was just responding to what Jeff said when Jeff said, look, we can't do it by adaptation. I think what Jeff is thinking of there is incremental adaptation, trying to keep the system staggering onward. But I just want to underscore that that's not what I was talking about earlier. I was talking about transformative adaptation, where we're trying to change the entire system, move to a much lower of energy use, relocalizing, etc. And by doing that, we would be radically reducing energy inputs, carbon damage, etc. And it seems to me that that is a viable approach. And indeed, it seems to me it's probably the only viable approach.
Rupert, thank you very much. Right, we are now drawing to a close on the end of session 2, and I'd like to move on to begin the third question pair. Slightly different format for these. Both questions will be addressed by both of our final 2 speakers, Jake Fiennes and Philip Richardson. And the 2 questions are, how far should the UK lead the world or seek to lead the world in CO2 reduction? And what can and should we be doing in Norfolk to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and adapt to climate change? And our first speaker on these 2 topics is Jake Fiennes.
Thank you. So Pablo's wonderful slides where he showed nearly 3/4 of climate change driven from fossil fuels. And there was an estimate, there was an element of about 1/4 of it was down to agriculture. So having had 30 years of land management experience in Norfolk, how can we make a difference? So the UK is already challenging itself with the 25-year environment plan. We've got the agricultural bill going through Parliament next week, and then it's closely followed by the environment bill for our preparation to leave Europe at the end of the year. So the UK is trying to lead a governmental example of how we can address this, because fundamentally, climate change and carbon capture is is best captured through biodiversity and nature conservation and land use. So the government is giving farmers, landowners and land occupiers the potential tools and the rewards and the support to enable this transition to happen. So what can we do in Norfolk? We can, farmers and landowners and land occupiers can look at different ways they can farm their land to maximize the capture of carbon. Doing that using biodiversity as the foundation for that capture. We've already seen species loss, we've seen habitat degradation, we've seen deforestation. All of these are having an impact, as Pablo's slides demonstrated, are having an impact on our climate. So we must recognize that we need to change the way that we produce our food. We need to change the way, change our diets as individuals. And we do have an opportunity here, and the UK is leading it. It is being looked at globally. There are some amazing examples of this in North America, in Australia, looking at regenerative agriculture as a possible way forward to contribute to changes in our climate. Norfolk is wonderfully exposed to sea level rise. Sea level rise is inevitable, and how can we change that? So we need to look at the way we value our land, how we work our soils, how we protect our soils. We also have diffuse pollution, we have chemical usage, and the NFU are looking to be net zero by 2040. The government is a slightly higher bar of 2050, but I think there is an opportunity within the UK, but also in Norfolk. Norfolk is an intensely agricultural county. And the reliance on these commodities, and a lot of the areas used are to produce biogas through AD maize or maize and ryegrass. So we must look at I am of the belief that there are solutions just around the corner where we follow the science and understand how we can underpin biodiversity to reduce climate change. And there are big institutions in America that are trying to understand the capture of carbon. And once we have a global agreement of the metric for capturing carbon within our soils, we then have the solution to what little land that we do have left that produces our food. We have solutions to make these so much more resilient.
Jake, thank you very much indeed. And now for perhaps a different perspective, or perhaps the same perspective, by Philip Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman. There was a danger that Jake and I might cover the same ground, but I will try to draw a broader picture and steer a little bit wider from agriculture with my talk. I'll begin with the first question. How far did the UK lead the world in carbon dioxide reduction? Well, if we feel strongly about an issue, most of us want to do something, don't we? And as a country, as Haley said, which benefited from early industrialization, many might feel we have a moral duty to set an example. But I beg to say that we need to be cautious. Were Britain to go it alone in becoming carbon neutral, it wouldn't reduce the rate of climate change much and would probably destroy our economy in the process, because in global terms, the UK carbon footprint is tiny. Just one example from my own area of interest, if you take the consumption of meat in China, it's 17 times more than it was 50 years ago, which means China consumes 25% of all the meat produced on the planet. So if Britain turned vegan tomorrow, it would hardly be noticed globally. We do need to address climate change urgently, but the country, we need to do it, or just as much as it takes to bring others with us. It will need strong and very focused leadership. I'm not myself we have it yet. Now, if I can move to the second question, what can we or should we do in Norfolk to reduce CO2 emissions and adapt to climate change? Well, in my view, the most important thing we can do is to write to politicians, to company bosses, and to others in positions of authority, demanding that they maximize efforts to secure international agreements and cooperation with other countries and other businesses to address the global challenges together. And we should keep writing till it's clear they're listening and taking it seriously. But I do make one very important proviso. There is generally poor understanding of the practical and the political difficulties posed in changing the status quo, or of the many linked challenges which Pablo referred to facing the world, and in which climate change is but one very important part. A deeper understanding of that complexity will allow us to prioritize better what needs to be done. And ultimately, Chairman, it is the sheer weight of informed public opinion which leads governments and businesses to change policy and consumers to change their lifestyles. I would just say I disagree strongly with Rupert Read on the mass demonstration argument of his by simply quoting the late Chief Justice of America, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said that fight for what you believe in, but do it in such a way that you bring others with you. Solutions which deny the role of the market in all of this are very often not helpful or practical, but we do urgently need to address what are called market failures in our economic system, and in particular, to recognize the true value of those things which all of us use, but none of us own: the air that we breathe, the oceans, the biodiversity of the planet. But that's not to say that we can't individually make lifestyle decisions now. We can take fewer holidays by air, we can do more cycling, some of us anyway, and use less renewable energy, or more renewable energy and less ordinary energy, and eating less, perhaps eating more local, reducing plastic use, you name it, we can do all of those things. And as a country, of course, we need to adapt. We can't in the long term protect our Norfolk coastline as it is, or save Broadland from higher water levels. But we can build houses to far better environmental standards. We can standardize our systems for waste disposal to recycle more effectively. But we shouldn't oppose every new road or every new development as a matter of principle. Each needs to be decided on merit, remembering that we do need a vibrant economy to fund the long-term adaptation measures that are needed. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There will be no solutions at all, though, if we fail to work together. And I'm pleased too, as Jake is, that the NFU has developed a net zero by 2040 policy. And I'd love to see the food industry and many other industries be proactive. We need to encourage long-term, cross-party, cross-departmental discussion and cooperation, as well as enhanced public information. And we need as a country to work much harder than we do with international partners to persuade them to do their bit. And I'll leave you with something that Bill Gates said a few years back, because I do feel that motivation, as Haley suggested, is important. He said, most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year, but underestimate what they can do in 10. Thank you.
Philip, thank you very much. Now, that's quite a perspective. I'm intrigued as to whether Jeff Price would agree with what Jake and Philip have just said, or whether he believes that the task is, whether he would be more inclined to agree with the position that Rupert Read took.
Well, in terms of farming, we need transformative farming, and we're always going to need food. We're going to need to come up with new technologies. We're certainly going to need to look much more at vertical farming, and farming can actually store much more carbon than it typically does, but it's usually at the cost of yield. And so the question is, how do we feed the planet, a growing planet, nutritious food, and maintain the yields while saving the biodiversity? So it's a very tricky situation that actually requires groups to work much more closely together than they currently do. You can't look at biodiversity by itself, because as biodiversity and species move, they're going to have to move through farmlands. And so how farmland is managed is going to be critical for how biodiversity can move. You can't look at farmland by itself without looking at biodiversity, because unless it's properly managed or it's properly sited in relation to reserves or edge habitats, you don't have enough pollinators to pollinate the crops and the yield falls. And with climate change, what you're looking at is the pollinators actually being one of the more sensitive groups overall. And so we need to take more action. So we need to be looking at how can we change the ways in which we do things. And in many cases, we're actually not talking about doing things in a new way. We're talking about going back to the way things used to be done prior to industrialization after World War II. And we're not necessarily talking about using horses for plowing, but we're talking about maintaining soil and using manure and turning manure into the soil, tilling less, holding more carbon, building the soil stocks back up. And none of that necessarily requires new thinking. Strip planting is not new thinking, but everybody's putting forward as the new way to do things. So we can actually find win-win solutions, both to reduce carbon, feed the planet, and save much of biodiversity.
Jeff, thank you very much. Haley, anything to add to what the three previous speakers have said?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, so where to start? And I guess probably where to start is to say that in terms of policy, we need to stop doing kind of, flagship green projects and then carry on doing things that, don't make any sense in terms of climate adaptation. When we look at things like the government saying they're going to spend 2 billion on cycle and walking routes and 27 billion on new roads, that's the equivalent of putting a couple of slices of cucumber with your chips and pretending that you're on a diet. We need to be actually embedding climate adaptation and mitigation in every decision that the government makes, nationally and locally. So that includes things like building a new road across an important area of biodiversity like the Wensum Valley. What on earth are we doing there? And that ties us into a car-dependent economy. So, we've got to remember that even if we switch to EVs, private cars are a catastrophically inefficient use of production resources and land. On average, most cars are parked 95% of the time. So we really need to be getting people out of cars and into public transport. And if we're going to do that, then it's got to be comprehensive. It's got to cover the whole county. And, in the modern age, it's not that difficult to imagine a transport system that's flexible, based on apps that can respond to demand, so that you're connecting up those areas that are poorly served at the moment, covering times that aren't currently covered. And that public transport needs to be affordable, or ideally free. It needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. It's got to be reliable, clean. That's the only way that we're going to move away from private cars. And what we can do then is we can make our larger towns and city centres car free. That frees up spaces for biodiversity, for parks, for growing community food, which improves the health of the population. It reduces the impacts of air pollution. It supports active transport. It improves our mental health and physical health. It cools the city during heat waves. These are things that can happen actually quite quickly if we decide that they can happen. I said this to my MP yesterday, and he said, that's going too fast for me. And I said, you know what, we're not negotiating with Brussels anymore. This is physics. It doesn't negotiate. There's a timeline on this, and either we get on with it or we don't. And we need to stop doing little things and pretending that's okay when actually the big things are wrong.
Haley, thank you. Very powerfully put. Pablo, do you have any additional perspectives on how the UK should be trying to lead the world in CO2 reduction, and what we can and should do in Norfolk to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and adapt to climate change?
Yeah, well, the UK is one of the richest countries, and I like the argument that Haley used before, that is, if it's not the UK, then who will lead? Because climate leadership actually has an impact. The evidence shows that. And given that we have the COP26 next year in the UK, that may create a big difference. But as a rich country, the UK also has a very strong innovation ecosystem. And it is very clear from the UK industrial strategy, particularly if you read the Green Growth Report, that there is a market opportunity for the UK regarding embracing the low carbon transformation, as China did. China embraced renewable energies, and now they are the world leading providers of wind turbines and solar energies. So for the UK, there is a big opportunity as a country in using their innovation ecosystem to take that opportunity. Now, at the local level, I will say, well, there were many good ideas, and I will not extend on detail. For me, the is voting. I believe that if you look at the last round of presidential elections worldwide, that effect will be for generations to come on our planet. Therefore, we need to choose our political representation carefully. We need to make them responsible for the decision that they take regarding the environment.
Pablo, thank you. That's a powerful finish. We will now begin the final Q&A session and ask our final two speakers to address some questions on their topics that have been sent in by the audience. The first question we have is for Jake Fines. And the question is, if there was just one thing that all the people watching this conference could do and should do to make a difference, what do you think that should be?
Frustratingly, it can't just be one thing. You have to all do multiple things. Mm-hmm. But if you have a general view that you think local but act global, so your actions locally, you can reduce your meat consumption, you can reduce your travel, you can instead of traveling to grand conferences across the country in our urban spaces, you can have them on Zoom. You can, I do hours and hours on Zoom. I've cut my travel down significantly. I haven't left Norfolk for 7 months. I haven't left Holkham Estate for probably 4 months. So I've changed. I've had a paradigm shift in my lifestyle. So if all of us can have paradigm shifts in our lifestyle, and COVID has exacerbated this and give us this opportunity for change, and actually once we've become used to it, it's not that bad after all. Yes, we all want to meet our nearest and dearest at Christmas, and hopefully we can. But I celebrated my 50th birthday via Zoom. So it's anything is possible.
Thank you very much, Jake. I've got a question, the same question for Philip. If there was just one thing that all the people watching this conference could do to make a difference, what do you think that should be?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Jake has said entirely, but you'll also have gathered from my talk that I'm somewhat critical of the level and the breadth of information that most people get from the media, from politicians, and dare I say it, from academia. If you compare the in-depth coverage which we get currently on COVID-19 to the climate change stories that tend to be in the center pages of the newspapers, unless they feature a photogenic polar bear or something, you can get a flavor of what I'm saying. Academics, I'm sorry to say, largely address one another rather than the general public, and politicians don't often work together towards long-term goals or give sufficient priority to climate change in their talks with foreign people. And many countries, of course, as we've heard, have a vested interest in slowing down the rate of change. I worried about this for 20 years before I sat down and wrote the book in last year about farming and food and climate change. The worry being that there are so many connected global issues, which Pablo referred to as well, which need to be dealt with as a whole alongside climate change. And I've mentioned some of them today: environment and biodiversity, exploitation of soils and fresh water, global population, poverty, affluence, and the related diet and health issues, food waste, science and technology, and of course, business self-interest and short-term politics and government shortcomings, to name a few. So really, my single plea to viewers today is, please gain, if you can, a broader knowledge of the range of issues that there are as you continue to press leaders for change, and make sure your children receive a balanced education, giving them the necessary base from which to press for the actions which will protect their future lives and livelihoods.
Philip, thank you. Those are very powerful points as well. We've had a lot of powerful points put this afternoon. I've got another question for Jake. This one anonymously from a vet. Is it realistic to expect people living in the countryside to abandon their petrol and diesel cars? Is green technology cheap enough yet for this to be realistic?
Well, the answer is in 2020, no, it's not realistic. There isn't the infrastructure, there isn't the public transport infrastructure within Norfolk. I travel all corners of Norfolk, and some of the areas are small villages and hamlets cut off from any sort of public transport. So currently it's not. So and then we look at electric vehicles. I am a slight skepticism on electric vehicles. I'm just worried about this huge use of resources for their batteries. These that we are potentially in years to come will bite us viciously in places we don't want to be bitten. So unfortunately, realistically, that's not an option. But actually, if we just travel less and make use, and if Norfolk can have a better broadband connectivity from one length of the county to the other, that will therefore, already I think we're seeing a less reliance on our cars. And hopefully when we can start to share our cars with our friends and neighbours, we can then reduce our impact on the planet a bit more.
Thank you, Jake. A final question for Philip, this from a Norfolk farmer. What specifically should Norfolk farmers do to make a difference?
Yes, the fact that farming is a business which needs to generate profits to survive is quite often forgotten in the heat of debate on topics like environmental damage or animal welfare. But I do think it's true that most farmers want to reduce their environmental and carbon footprint. But what they can do is going to be largely guided by the available technology, by government policies, by consumer demand, and not least by economics. And the balance of all of these pressures will determine what farmers here in Norfolk and elsewhere will do in coming years. So government regulation will largely guide what chemicals can be used, or whether farmers take additional measures to minimize pollution, for instance. Government schemes, such as the one Jake referred to, will largely drive the establishment and upkeep of environmental features on the farm. And certainly ideas are currently being discussed how to encourage on-farm carbon footprint reduction and soil carbon sequestration, as well as with reduction in methane and nitrous oxide emission from livestock and soils.
I'd like to finish by, have you been cut off, Philip? No, you're there, good. Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm here.
Have you finished your point?
Just to finish by saying that none of these are easily done or easily measured. Just an example, there are in excess of 50 different ways of purporting to measure carbon footprint on a farm today. Are any of them useful? We simply don't know. Perhaps science and technology will come to our assistance.
I'd like to finish by asking you both the same question. One of the most powerful points that I've heard today is that, and it's several of the points put together, that even if we were all to transfer to electric vehicles, even if that was possible and they didn't have these battery problems which Jake has referred to, that in itself doesn't solve the problem if the electricity is being provided by fossil fuel power stations. And if it takes 50 years to replace those, or $100 trillion to replace those, that investment is not to be given. So if that is a situation, where do you think we're most likely to be in 20 years' time with the current level of commitment to climate, to managing climate change? Ask Jake first.
I think, unfortunately, Rupert's not here to listen, but I think there is real hope and opportunity. There is definitely, there is a local, a national, a global recognition, which is that climate change is here and it's here to stay. And we have the ability, if we listen to the science, to make amends and make a change. So I think and I think the biggest catalyst for governments to react and industry to react will be a global food disaster. You know, that's when we have mass starvation. Then that's when the parents, Rupert's parents, will all come out on the streets and demonstrate. But until we have that, until we had hundreds of thousands or hundreds of people dying weekly due to COVID, at that point, government reacted. So until we have a catastrophic environmental disaster that affects every one of us, then governments will start to act, and they will act collectively. God forbid we don't have that in the next 10 years, but if we, at least we're starting to recognize that we need to do something, and the sooner we address that, the better it'll be.
Philip, anything to add to that?
Well, I felt that was a little pessimistic, to be honest. It will be very tough, there is no doubt, over the next 20 odd years, and there is no single solution to all of this. We're going to have to find our way through it. But as Rupert said, I think he was being over pessimistic, I hope. But he did say we're going to have to mitigate and we're going to have to adapt, and there is no question that that's what we'll have to do. But I do think motivation is an important thing to bear in mind, and I just think it might be worth leaving you with a quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, you'll remember, in South Africa, who, when asked when he was an optimist or a pessimist, said, "I am a prisoner of hope, and that is what I am."
Philip, thank you. That's a very good quote to finish on. That, I'm afraid, is all we've got time for. Many thanks indeed to our panel of experts, Dr. Hayley Mills, Professor Rupert Reed, Dr. Pablo Salas, Dr. Jeff Price, Jake Fines, and Philip Richardson for their most thoughtful inputs. And to those of you in the audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you feel you've all now got a much better idea of the future we are potentially facing with climate change and what we need to do about it individually, not only to educate ourselves better on the issue, but also to reduce our carbon footprint and persuade our government to take the right action. If there's one message I've picked up from today, it's just that that just moving to electric vehicles will not solve the problem. We have to replace fossil fuel power stations, and that will be hugely expensive. Sorry to those of you who submitted questions and didn't get them asked. However, there will be an article in the EDP which contains a synopsis of all the questions raised today. So thank you again, and goodbye.